Yes, that is correct. Did you know that after the Civil War ended, a group of Irish Americans known as the Fenian Brotherhood started invading Canada because they were trying to fight the British? The Fenian Brotherhood was the American counterpart to the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB, in Ireland, an Irish nationalist group. And they operated almost like a government in exile. They had their own constitution and they had their own leaders, like presidents, for instance. The Civil War had given Irish immigrants a great deal of military experience, and they wanted to put that to good use against the British. However, there was a dispute as to what the right course of action was. You had John O'Mahony, the president of the Fenian Brotherhood, who believes that Irish veterans of the Civil War should go back to Ireland and fight the British there. However, you have people like William Randall Roberts, who instead believes that the Fenians should invade Canada, secure Providence, and then use that as ransom against the British. Canada was still a British colony during this time under British military protection, so it was also believed that if the Fenians were to successfully invade Canada, well, that would divert British forces away from Ireland, which would give the Irish more of a fighting chance if they were to revolt. So at a convention of Fenians in Cincinnati, Ohio, William Randall Roberts dissolves the presidency and he replaces it with a Senate, which is filled with his friends. Then later he meets with President Andrew Johnson and with Secretary of State William Seward, and he asks them what would happen if the Fenians were to invade Canada. He doesn't really get a firm response, but he uses this as validation for indicating that the US will not intervene if the Fenians invade. It's also important to understand that during this time there's a lot of anger towards Canada because Canada, being part of Britain, was sympathetic to the Confederacy. So Confederate spies were able to base their operations in Canada, and they would conduct raids on the northern part of the US, doing things such as stealing ships, and people wanted to retaliate against that, including a lot of members of the Fenian Brotherhood. So in April of 1866, about 700 Fenians arrive in the state of Maine with the goal of taking New Brunswick. However, they are turned away with the arrival of Royal Navy officer Charles Hastings Doyle, who arrives with 700 of his own troops from Nova Scotia. So the first raid is effectively aborted. Then on June 1st, 1866, from Buffalo, New York, about 1,000 to 1,500 Fenians cross the Niagara River in order to take Fort Erie from the Canadians. They're led by a John O'Neill and a Thomas William Sweeney. So as the Fenians are crossing the Niagara River, the area is supposed to be patrolled by the USS Michigan. However, the ship is delayed for 14 hours because on the night previously, Second Assistant Engineer James P. Kelly gets the pilot, Patrick Murphy, drunk, and then he provides him with a lady for entertainment. Despite this delay, however, the Michigan would later arrive on June 1st at the Niagara River crossing, and they would intercept multiple Fenian supply boats, which would severely limit the logistics of the Fenian Brotherhood. On the morning of June 2nd, the Fenians would then run into about 900 Canadian militiamen at the Battle of Ridgeway. They would fight for about 2 hours, but the Canadians were less organized, and due to a miscommunication error, they would retreat, which would lead to a bayonet charge by the Fenians. A total of 13 Canadians would die, with about 94 wounded, and about 10 Fenians would die, with 16 wounded from the Battle of Ridgeway. The Fenians would later encounter the Canadians at Fort Erie, where they would take about 50 Canadians prisoner. However, they would be intercepted by another 5,000 Canadian militiamen. And because they lacked logistical support, because the USS Michigan was cutting off their supply boats, and they were dealing with things such as desertion, they eventually fled back to the United States. Later on June 7th, 1866, led by a Samuel P. Spear, about 1,000 Fenians later took multiple towns in modern-day Quebec, such as Pigeon Hill, but they were again intercepted by Canadian militiamen and they surrendered. In response to this, President Johnson sent Generals Ulysses S. Grant as well as George Meade to intercept the Fenians, making sure that they didn't violate the border anymore. They had their weapons seized, and then they later arrested anyone who even looked like a Fenian. Now, it's believed by some that this was a deliberate political move by Johnson. He took away the guns of the Fenians and then he gave it back in exchange for Irish American support. What's also interesting is that while these raids were ultimately ineffective, it is believed to have been partially influential in Canadian Confederation, which took place in 1867 with the provinces uniting. 1867 would also be the year of the Fenian Rising, a failed rebellion against the British in Ireland, which was led by the IRB as well as the Fenian Brotherhood. This wasn't the last of the raids, however. In 1870, the Fenians would invade Quebec again. However, because the Brotherhood had been infiltrated by Canadian spies, they were well aware of this, and this would lead to the Battle of Eccles Hill, which was ultimately a failure. John O'Neill would later be arrested and sentenced to 2 years of prison, but then he would be pardoned by President Grant in October of that year. Then finally, in 1871, John O'Neill organizes a raid on Manitoba from St. Paul, Minnesota. He takes 35 men with him, armed with guns loaned to him from the Fenian Brotherhood, and he seizes a Canadian customs house as well as a Hudson Bay Trading Company post. However, to his dismay, he finds out that the border is actually 2 miles north of where he is. He is still in the United States in the Dakota Territory. He never even entered Canada at all. The Fenian Brotherhood would also have its guns taken away from them again in 1870 by the US government, but they weren't returned. They were sold as surplus in 1871, and there was never another attempt to invade Canada again after the last ordeal by John O'Neill.